If human childbirth already sounds intense, then the animal kingdom may be the last place you would want to look for comfort. Out there, birth is not always a gentle beginning. Sometimes it feels more like a brutal test of endurance. In some species, mothers must push out offspring that seem far too large for their bodies. In others, they must endure anatomical structures so strange they almost defy logic. There are births marked by crushing pressure, dangerous internal damage, and physical stress that begins long before the young even arrive. And perhaps the most disturbing part is this. These terrifying ordeals are not limited to enormous animals. Some of the harshest births in nature come from creatures most people would never suspect. So before we go any further, which sounds worse to you, giving birth to something oversized, something covered in built-in weapons, or something that turns survival into a race from the very first second of life? One, hyena. We begin with the hyena, and this is one of those cases where nature seems to have handled reproduction with astonishing cruelty. For female hyenas, childbirth is not simply painful, it is biologically brutal. They possess an extremely unusual anatomical structure, a pseudo-penis that is longer and more rigid than the male's reproductive organ. And yes, it is through that structure that birth takes place. The problem becomes even more severe because hyena cubs are born relatively large. They arrive with teeth already formed and with enough strength to fight among themselves only minutes after birth. Now picture that cub trying to pass through a narrow, elongated, and poorly flexible canal that was never truly suited for such a task. The result is a labor that is slow, intensely painful, and filled with danger at every stage. Many females die during their first pregnancy because of internal rupture, hemorrhage, or infection. In many cases, the cub does not survive the passage either. The mortality rate in a first birth is frighteningly high for both mother and newborn, and the suffering does not end even when the birth is successful. Tissues can tear, the canal may become permanently widened, and recovery can be painfully slow. All of this happens while the mother must still remain alert, ready to protect her cub from predators and from other hyenas, animals hardly known for kindness. And if that sounds merciless already, what happens when the real problem is not a cub, but an egg so huge it nearly takes over the mother's entire body? Natusuma, kiwi bird. After a birth that feels biologically cruel, we move to one of nature's most absurd examples of physical disproportion. And if there is any creature that seems to have taken exaggeration too far, it is the kiwi bird. The kiwi is a small, secretive bird that lives on the forest floor in New Zealand. At first glance, it does not look like an animal that would be associated with one of the most extreme reproductive burdens in the animal world. But what the female carries inside her body is almost unbelievable. She lays one of the largest eggs in the bird kingdom in proportion to her own size. To understand how extreme this is, the egg can reach up to 25% of the mother's body weight. For weeks, the female's body is practically dominated by that single egg. Her internal organs are compressed, her stomach is left with barely any room, and feeding becomes incredibly difficult. In fact, many females stop eating shortly before laying because there is simply no more space inside. And when the moment finally arrives, it is not quick and it is certainly not easy. The effort is immense. The egg is so large that the cloaca must stretch to its absolute limit, and the risk of exhaustion is very real. In simple terms, the kiwi's body spends weeks in a state of biological emergency just to complete this one process. And perhaps the most ironic part comes afterwards. After enduring all of that strain, it is usually the male that takes on most of the incubation work. The female goes through the ordeal, lays the egg, and nature almost seems to say, "Now it is your turn." But what if the challenge is not an oversized egg, but a baby that appears to be born wearing weapons? 3. Porcupine. At first glance, it seems impossible. How can an animal covered in quills give birth without turning the whole process into an internal horror scene? This is where porcupine biology becomes both surprising and strangely clever. The young are not born with the hard, sharp quills we associate with adult porcupines. At birth, those quills are soft, flexible, and covered by a layer of skin and fluid, specifically to prevent them from piercing the mother during delivery. But that does not mean the birth is easy. Even softened quills still create a serious challenge. The process demands extreme dilation, prolonged physical effort, and a great deal of strain on the female's body. It is delicate in a way that leaves very little margin for error. Any complication can lead to internal injury, infection, or severe stress for the mother. And the clock begins ticking almost immediately. Within just a few hours of birth, the quills start to harden rapidly. So although the young arrive in a safer form, nature wastes no time turning them into the armored animals they are meant to become. That makes the entire process feel like a narrow window in which everything has to go right. There is also the fact that porcupine young are born relatively well developed. They already have their eyes open and show good mobility soon after birth. That means more size, more pressure, and more effort during delivery. It is yet another case where nature seems to say that the birth may succeed, but comfort was never part of the design. 4. Stumpy-tailed lizard. After giant eggs and strategically softened quills, we arrive at a birth that answers a question nobody really asked. What if the baby came out almost fully finished? The stumpy-tailed lizard does not lay eggs. It is viviparous, which means the young develop inside the mother's body and are born alive. So far, that may not sound too extreme. The real problem begins when you realize just how large those young are in relation to the mother. In many cases, the female gives birth to only one or two offspring simply because there is no room for more. Each of them can represent an enormous proportion of her body weight. It is as though nature made a decision to produce fewer young, but make each one physically overwhelming. And that choice comes at a serious cost during birth. The delivery is slow, exhausting, and intensely draining. The birth canal must stretch far beyond anything that could be considered comfortable. The muscles are pushed to their limit, and the risk of internal injury is very real. This is not a quick release of pressure. It is a long, quiet, and physically punishing process. What makes it even harder is that these young are already well developed when they are born. They have rigid scales and sturdy bodies. There are no soft quills to help, no eggshell to break later, and no gentler stage between development and birth. Everything arrives at once, directly and at full force. By the time the process is over, the mother is visibly exhausted, while the young are already active, responsive, and nearly independent from the moment they enter the world. 5. Giraffe. After offspring that are far too large for a small body, we move to a birth that seems simple only until you remember the height involved. A giraffe gives birth standing up, not because it is convenient, but because for an animal of that size there is hardly any other practical option. And that means the calf enters the world by falling straight to the ground from a height that can exceed 1.5 meters in its very first second of life. But even before that fall, the birth itself is already an enormous physical challenge. A giraffe calf is born large, weighing many kilograms, with long legs, a long neck, and a body that is anything but compact. All of that has to pass through the birth canal in a process that is slow, exhausting, and extremely demanding for the mother. The contractions are powerful, the effort is prolonged, and the risk of complications is real, especially if the calf is not positioned correctly. A poor position can delay the birth and make the strain even worse. It is not unusual for the female to spend hours going through this while remaining fully exposed and vulnerable. And when it is finally over, the calf drops heavily to the ground. As brutal as that looks, it is actually part of the plan. The impact helps break the umbilical cord and stimulates the calf's first breath, but that does not make the scene any less dramatic, nor does it make the process any less punishing for the mother, who has just endured one of the most physically demanding births among land mammals. And there is no real pause afterwards. Within minutes, the calf must try to stand, while the mother, still exhausted, has to stay alert for predators. The birth ends and survival begins immediately. Shuckas. Elephant after births shaped by height, strain, and sheer physical demand, we come to an animal in which nature seems to have pushed endurance and patience to their absolute limits, the elephant. A female elephant carries her calf for around 22 months, nearly 2 full years of pregnancy. That is the longest gestation period of any land mammal, and this is not simply a matter of waiting. It means sustaining a growing calf that can weigh more than 100 kilograms at birth. Throughout that long pregnancy, the mother's body is under constant pressure. The extra weight places strain on her joints, muscles, and internal organs. Movement becomes slower, energy demands increase, and every physical effort asks more of her than it normally would. The pregnancy alone is already a prolonged test of strength, and when birth finally arrives, relief does not come quickly. Delivery is slow and requires intense contractions and tremendous effort to bring a massive calf through the birth canal. The newborn has a broad head, a heavy body, and strong limbs, so this is neither a quick nor an easy process. It is long, difficult, and physically punishing from beginning to end. What makes it almost ironic is that after all of this, the calf is still born completely dependent. It cannot see properly, does not yet control its body well, and needs immediate help just to stand. So after nearly 2 years of carrying such a burden, the work is still far from over. Fortunately, elephant mothers usually do not face this ordeal alone. Other females often stay nearby during the birth, forming a kind of support team, not because it is touching, but because it is necessary. Chombihum, Nivuifen Tasmanian Devil. After nearly 2 years of pregnancy and enormous newborns, we arrive at a birth that shows nature can be just as cruel in a completely different way. The Tasmanian Devil is a marsupial, and that changes everything. The female's pregnancy lasts only about 3 weeks, and the young are born astonishingly small, about the size of a grain of rice. At first, that sounds as though it should make birth easier. In reality, the worst part begins immediately afterwards. Once they are born, these tiny unfinished young must crawl up the mother's body on their own until they reach the pouch. There is no help, no transport, and no second chance. It is a race for survival on the very day they enter the world. And the odds are brutal. A female may give birth to as many as 20 young, yet she has only 4 teats inside the pouch. That means only the 4 fastest and strongest can attach themselves and continue developing. The rest simply do not survive. So while the birth itself may not be long, the physiological burden on the mother is still enormous. She must produce many young at once, endure immediate exhaustion, and then go through a ruthless process of natural selection unfolding through her own body. And even after everything settles, the surviving young remain attached inside the pouch for months, completely dependent on her. In the Tasmanian Devil, the cruelty does not come from giant bones, violent falls, or a drawn-out pregnancy. It comes from the simple and merciless reality that birth is only the beginning of a contest. Not every newborn is meant to win. And with that, we reach the end of a list that makes one thing painfully clear. In the animal kingdom, birth can be anything but gentle. Nature does not promise comfort. It only proves again and again that survival has never been easy, not even on the very first day of life. Whether it is a hyena forced through a cruel anatomical design, a kiwi overwhelmed by an impossibly large egg, or a Tasmanian devil born straight into a fight for survival, each case shows just how harsh the beginning of life can be. So which of these births shocked you the most? And do you know of any animal whose birth might be even more extreme? If you enjoyed this look at the harsher side of the natural world, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more astonishing stories from the animal kingdom.